Landscapers is a good show, elevated to a great show by two amazing lead performances from Olivia Colman and David Thewlis. But the thing that takes this from a great show into an absolutely spectacular must-watch viewing show is the surreal visual style and crazy wild stylistic filmmaking decisions. We've got unconventional black and white sequences. We've got fluoro-colored lighting, oversaturating and over-drenching sequences. We've got beautiful metaphorical side stories that are used to deep dive into the psyches of our main two characters. And then we do have more traditional filmmaking styles that aren't flashy or grand or, epic in any way, but they're bare bones in that perfect way that kind of encapsulates this story that is truly being told outside of the characters' kind of fairy tale delusions of the world they think they're living in. And all of this is kind of like brought together by this amazing art direction, this beautiful looking show that is so many different things at once, but is telling one very unique and like specific story. And it's just a marvel to behold. If this sounds like your cup of tea and you haven't actually seen Landscapers, bloody go check it out, stop this video, check it out and come back, because I'm going to get into some spoilers of all the, visual filmmaking and arty kind of decisions they make that really stood out to me. There's a sequence that is like this dramatic, non-comedy version of that Mel Brooks scene in Blazing Saddles, like at the end of the film, where they're all having a brawl and then suddenly it breaks out and it literally breaks the fourth wall and explodes out onto the movie set in Hollywood, like a Hollywood movie set, and it's all just crazy and it goes bam, 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 and it just keeps getting crazier and crazier, but it breaks the fourth wall and we go into like the set of the film. In Landscapers, it's a more intense, dramatic version of that, where in an interrogation room, everything's, normal and like a classic kind of cliche cop interrogation, and then suddenly the camera pans out and everyone gets up and they move from like set to set, like on a soundstage, into the rooms they're talking about on the night of the murder. And she's like, this is how it played out. And everyone's picking up guns, it's super meta and crazy, and everyone's kind of like playing their role like it's a theater play, but it's like a dress rehearsal where they're all kind of getting used to it and they're all like, okay, so I pick up the gun here, and it's like, okay, I'll pick up the gun. But Olivia Colman is just the character in the interrogation still being like, no, this isn't how it happened, no. And they're like, this is how it's going to play out. This is how we're going to explain it to the jury and everything. It's a spectacular visual way to show how this scene and this whole moment in her life is getting out of Olivia Colman's hands, and everything is kind of being, she's barely able to keep up with this scene and the interrogation as we move from room to room to room, to situation to situation to situation, and she's completely losing her mind as this scene starts to lose its mind and get completely crazy. But it's also like a really fun kind of play on her obsession and love of film and filmmaking, but it's also a really fun way to show how the jury is going to be visualizing this scene, and it kind of plays out like a theater play, like a story being told, the way that the cops are going to be telling the story and showing their side and their angle of it to the jury, as opposed to the way that Olivia Colman's character is trying to tell her side of the story and her kind of version of it. So it's this really kind of interesting way to show how everyone's showing their story of it, and showing it in this really weird visual theater kind of way is like really, really interesting. But it's also just a fun, creative visual way to kind of, make it not a cliche cop by the numbers seen it a million times before cop interrogation. And it just works on so many levels. I absolutely love this sequence. It was such an inventive, creative decision that works, not just being like, let's do something crazy and wild just for the sake of it. It was so grounded in the characters and the situation and everything. It works so well on all those levels. Just wow. This crazy filmmaking choice and all the other surreal decisions made throughout this series aren't just made for the sake of being like, let's just be crazy and surreal and just whatever. It's not just wild filmmaking for the sake of it. It's always rooted deep in the psyche of our two main characters and how they see themselves in the world and in this kind of situation that they're in. Our two lead characters, Olivia Colman and David Thewlis, they're obsessed with film. They're obsessed with like the old cinema, old westerns and gunslingers and those heroic kind of badass types from like the golden age of cinema, as they say. The couple's love of these old film heroes, these gunslingers, these, heroic people in these old westerns really shapes how these two characters see themselves in this story that is essentially just like, did they murder their parents for money and because they hated them and stuff, and it, really shapes how they see themselves in this story, which is really, really fascinating. And then it kind of has this extra layer on top of it with all these surreal filmic decisions. Like there are so many moments in this series where we see David Thewlis' character lit behind with this heroic backlight, and he's just, presented in this way that like makes you go, oh, it's like an old Hollywood film where we're meant to think this guy's the hero and he's saving the damsel in distress, and that's how he sees himself, not as kind of a slimy, murder of people who maybe were asleep when they killed them and stuff like that, which is a really fun kind of horrid twist on the kind of someone's obsession with, film and characters that play certain types, almost anti-heroic characters that they see as heroic, and the way that kind of twists these characters' minds in their own, like, real-life setting. There are several moments throughout the series where Lupin is presented as this, like, gunslinging hero damsel in distress saving, like, bang bang, I'm the hero of this story. And it really kind of is reinforced as well by in the real world. We see lots of characters discuss how he loves to save all those that he thinks is weak and needing of help that are around him, but he's never able to do it properly and stuff. And then we actually hear him say, like, at least 10 times that his wife, who he truly loves, is fragile. And he's kind of got this really bizarre and kind of toxic hero complex where he needs to save everyone around him. And he sees himself as like a Gary Cooper, as like a hero of these old Western films. And it's this really kind of, I don't know, bizarre, demented kind of character that he sees himself in. And so using all these filming decisions, like all these black and white sequences where he's like dressed as a cowboy and everything, really kind of reinforce how he sees himself. And so the jury and the cops and even the audience and the general public in the show see him as like a black hat wearing villain of a Western, but he sees himself as the white hat wearing character in the Western. And this was really fascinating and interesting, and where the show was really kind of succeeding is this kind of bizarre way that he sees himself, and all they as the couple see themselves, and then how everyone else kind of perceives them. And so the final episode, which spends most of its time in the court, in this black and white court sequence as like it all goes through it, we then get kind of like a side story that's set in Western times with amazing sets, amazing art direction, amazing costumes, and we see the entire series that we've seen so far and all the events play out, but like kind of in a Western film setting. And it's completely on the nose, it's completely obvious what is happening, but it's so brilliant to kind of just properly reinforce and really kind of, hammer home kind of what these two characters see themselves as. These two people that, with all the evidence that we've seen throughout the series, it's pretty obvious they just shot these two old people, these defenseless old people, in their home, in their beds, while they were probably sleeping, for their money, for the house, because they hated them, and all these kind of things. But then we see them as like these heroic cowboy gunslingers running away from the damn cops and all this kind of stuff that's just like really fascinating, really fun. It's brought beautifully to life by the two performances that really carry it beyond being just kind of like a little on the nose. And the art direction, the way it all looks is just beautiful. And it's just such a fun, different, interesting, unique way to tell this story. And it really it just works for me on all levels. I can see how someone might be like a bit battered over the head with what they're trying to, say with these kind of side story, metaphorical Western aspect of the series, because it's just repeating everything we've seen. But I really, really liked it. I thought it was incredibly interesting and just like a breath of fresh air in a classic kind of cop interrogation show where the meat of the series is just cops interrogating these two people and, the court case and all that stuff, which we've seen a million times. So this really was just kind of like a wild, inventive, different way to kind of see this story, but always, always rooted deep in like the characters' psyches, which I thought was just incredible. And so finally, when they're both locked up in prison, the sentence has been done, the series is over, we get this final kind of hurrah of like the filmmaking decisions and stylistic breaking the fourth wall of like them on film sets in this dreamlike fantasy, delusions they have. We have Olivia Colman's character. She's sitting there alone forever now. But then like, instead of just ending on her just like trapped alone in a prison cell, like her wall, like literally like in Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, it like breaks open. Well, I think it lifts up kind of a bit more elegantly than smashing open. But still, we then see like, it's not in a prison cell. She's like on a set, and then there's a desert, like a Western desert. David Thewlis is there. He's bloody standing there looking like a heroic, sexy gunslinger. And they both walk through like there's like an orchestra, a film set, film directors, cameras, lights, everything. They get on a horse. It's really dramatic. It's old Western, kind of old classic golden cinema age looking just set and everything. And then they get on the horse. The music builds. It crescendos. And then the director's like, action. And the final thing we get is of like an old, filmy reel kind of looking footage of them both riding off on a horse into the sunset. And it's beautifully poignant and dramatic and heroic and beautiful, and just, it's this dreamlike fantasy, beautiful film looking shot. and it's kind of beautiful and amazing. But then there's this like really weird, twisted sense of kind of tragedy and heartbreak and sadness, because this is her dream fantasy. This isn't what's happening. In reality, she's alone in her cell, and she's going to be alone forever, away from the only person, the only man who's ever loved her, that's ever made her feel safe. And it's a powerful final scene, and it really kind of reinforces and hammers home why this unique filming decision of not making this kind of a traditional kind of cop interrogation crime show, and, you know, using all these crazy elements of breaking the fourth wall, using film sets, their obsession with film, and all of this kind of comes together with this beautiful final scene. And it's just wow. It's just like, oh man. Whoever made this knew exactly what they wanted to say and do with this series, and I think they executed that perfectly. Whether it's a bit too much for some people, a bit over the top, potentially, very potentially, but for me, it worked, and it was just like, oh boy, I loved it. This show reminds me a lot of Natural Born Killers, the film, and the way that is bolstered up as well by these incredible, wild, visual filmmaking decisions that are just so interesting and fun to watch. And like that, the two lead performances are so strong that it doesn't make it feel too crazy and too wild. We're like, oh, this is getting a bit out of hand. And just like that movie, this show, Landscape, is the two performances are spectacular. They make the crazy Western things feel real and true, and, you know, all the scenes that play out that are a bit heightened and dramatic and crazy lighting and this and that, they always make it feel real in a sense, even when it's very dreamlike and fantastical. The performances are breathtaking. They are tragic and heartbreaking, but also a little disturbing and hard to watch at times. I find the characters mostly really sympathetic, especially the Olivia Colman character, where her parents are described as absolutely horrific and awful, terrible people, and the things that we hear about them, especially towards the dad, are just despicable and intolerable. But the one aspect, I mean, and this is a really interesting wrinkle to have on it, but I was still a bit unsure how I felt about it, is the fact that, like, they say, like, she says, like, my dad molested me as a kid. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty awful. But so much of what you're telling us is like a fabrication, allegedly. So much of it is like falsehoods and stuff, and we're actually, you know, a lot of your story of how you killed them, it seems pretty obvious is a lie, and, you know, a manipulation so that you're not, you know, arrested for murder, and it's just manslaughter and all that kind of stuff. So it's really hard to kind of take your word on your parents at face value, because we do get scenes that are played as real, but there are so many dreamlike, fantastical fantasy scenes playing out in this series, and there's so much of it where we see them seeing themselves as the heroic gunslinger, and they're the wicked parents that must be stopped to save the damsel in distress, and all this kind of stuff. But I'm still a bit unsure, being like, whoa, how much of that parent stuff is true? Because there's a lot of stuff in this where it's like, you killed them for money because you were broke. And yeah, you might have hated them, but did they deserve to be hated? And all these things that are really fascinating and interesting. And I was unsure where I was meant to kind of land on it at the end. And not to say that's a good or bad thing. It was just kind of fascinating to be like, yes, you could just take it at face value that they're the worst parents ever. And in some ways, no one really deserves to die, but in some ways, what he did is unspeakable and, you know, unforgivable. So you kind of feel sympathy and, you know, you understand why they did what they did. But I'm not sure I can trust their word on all of that stuff. And there's one line where the cops say, like, oh, allegedly. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a really interesting, like, scary kind of point, because so much of how they present these characters is fake and false, and they see themselves as these heroes. So just, I don't know, I thought that was a really interesting, kind of terrifying wrinkle to kind of put on it, where it's like unsure how to trust what they say. And, you know, I'm unsure what the filmmakers want me to think as well, because on one hand, they're sympathetic, but on one hand, it's implied that, you know, David Thewlis shoots both the parents in a bed while they're sleeping, which is pretty intense and horrible, so I don't know. And we get a couple of really beautiful moments with the Olivia Colman and her lawyer, and the lawyer's like, I kind of understand where you're coming from, and she tells a couple of stories about how she faked the letters from this really famous actor, and, you know, and they have all these really interesting stories and kind of conversations together about how true and powerful and real this couple's love is. And it does really appear to be very true and powerful, and it's kind of sweet and beautiful. But then you think about it and you're like, well, this couple's love led to this brutal murder of her parents, and it's kind of this twisted kind of take on love and how far true love can force you to do things that you might not have thought you're capable of. And I thought that was really interesting as well. And another angle I thought was kind of a little weird, that maybe not as sympathetic as I think maybe the filmmakers wanted me to feel about them, is the whole situation kind of feels like they kind of fell into it. Like, the cops only get so far because they keep kind of slipping up in really dumb and silly ways that feels really unthought out. They've been getting away with it for 15 years, and now they kind of come back into it. So it just felt a bit weird where I'm like, I can't feel too much sympathy towards them when they're just completely screwing up this interrogation, and like, I don't know. It just felt a bit kind of like, oh, you're so obviously guilty, and you just keep being like, what? No, we're not guilty. Oh, it's just mess. And it's like every single thing, like you didn't think this through at all. So it feels very callous and heartless in ways as well. But I guess that's the whole point. It's meant to be this grey, murky murder mystery, you know, I don't know. But the show never really kind of commits to being like, did they do it? Did they not? Kind of from the get-go, it's like, they say they didn't, but they totally did. So I don't know, that mystery is kind of never there fully. And like the cop characters never fully developed. Even though it's 4 episodes, it doesn't feel rushed, but I feel like maybe with 6 episodes to kind of flesh everything out a little bit more, everything might have worked a bit stronger. I just wonder, because the murder mystery isn't as strong as it could be, the cop characters aren't very developed, a lot of the things don't feel fully developed, like a lot of the interrogation stuff suddenly just is like, he'll say something and then it's like, oh, okay, cool. He said he uses guns and she can't touch guns. It's clearly him. And they don't really kind of wring out the drama and the tension in ways that I think could have been more kind of exciting. And so I just wonder if you take away the brilliant filmmaking styles and visual art direction and all these wild, crazy, surreal, dreamlike choices that, you know, that are amazing, but if you take them away, and you also have 2 lead actors that I don't just love seeing, you know, in Olivia Colman and David Thewlis, and you just have 2 randoms, and so without those 2 amazing elements, would this just be another British crime cop show, you know, that's kind of forgettable? And, you know, your mum's like, I watched this great crime cop show. And you're like, what happened in it? She's like, I don't really remember. And you're like, what's it called? And she's like, I don't really remember. And you're like, okay, well, it probably wasn't very memorable then. Would this show just be that without those 2 elements? And unfortunately, I think the answer is yes.